Good evening and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dan Sutter with the Johnson Center for Political Economy here at Troy University. The U.S. economy has experienced a very slow and sluggish recovery from the Great Recession of 2008. This has been seen in a stubborn and slow to decline unemployment rate. Although the unemployment rate is getting down, it is showing progress here. It's been slow to yield and return to normal levels. And in addition to that, the unemployment rate is just a tip-off that there are several other elements of both the labor market and investment that are responding very differently after this recession than before. The sluggish recovery of the U.S. economy since 2008 has brought to many economists' attention an idea that was first proposed to help explain the depth and extent of the Great Depression, something known as regime uncertainty. Here to discuss with us tonight about this idea of regime uncertainty and how it might apply to today's economic environment is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. G.P. Manish.
Hi Dan, it's great to be with you.
Welcome back to the show.
Thanks.
So what's going on with our labor market and what's up?
Well, the big picture really is that the unemployment rate isn't really picking up the true story of what's going on in the labor market.
So here we have a graph of showing what's happened with the unemployment rate basically back from at the start of the last recession to today.
Yes, so you can see here that there's been a steady decline in the unemployment rate since the beginning of 2010 when it hit its peak late 09, early 2010. But it's still rather high by historical standards. It's now at 6.7%.
And just so viewers would recognize here, the unemployment rate actually started down several months after the end of the official end of the recession.
Of course, yes. The recession officially ended in June 2009. So it took a long time for the unemployment rate to come anywhere below like even 8%, as you can see from this graph.
But for unemployment to be slow to respond afterwards, that's actually typical of the economy, right?
Well, yes, but even with respect to the unemployment rate, this has been historically rather slow. But yeah.
So we're used to it, not falling immediately.
Exactly. It doesn't fall immediately, but it still falls, maybe within 2 or 3 years of the onset of, with the finishing of the recession.
This is a longer time series of the unemployment, so we're not focusing as much on this last recession, but just to be able to put this sort of in a longer term perspective.
Right. So you can see here that after the crisis of 2008, you had a huge spike in the unemployment rate. I mean, historically very, very high. Even now, as you can see from this graph, a 6.7% unemployment rate is really high if you look at post-war, American economic history.
And in particular, I mean, it's really kind of a little hard to tell here, but if we look at that spike in unemployment in the early 1980s, that's very much like a peak. I mean, that's a jagged peak.
Absolutely.
And the fact that it's so steep coming on the right-hand side of the peak shows that the economy was recovering quickly.
Exactly, right.
And the slope coming down from our most recent peak
is not as steep. Yeah.
Is noticeably, I think, a little flatter.
Absolutely, yes.
But actually, though, we can actually see what's going on with the labor market a little more dramatically if we look at some other measures. Right?
Yes, that's correct. So one of the features of this current recession and recovery, which we haven't seen since World War II, is really the fact that there's been a huge decline in the labor force participation rate. So now what the labor force participation rate tells us is essentially what percentage or what proportion of the adult population in the country is either employed or is actively seeking work. What's happened in the last 4 or 5 years is that a lot of people have just dropped out of the labor force altogether. In other words, they are not actively seeking work. Instead of continuing to actively seek work, they just drop out of the labor force. They stop looking for work and so are not picked up in the official unemployment figures.
So in this diagram here, in this graph, we have the actual labor force participation rate is the solid line.
Right. The solid line is the labor force participation rate. The other two lines are projections by the CBO and the Bureau of Labor Statistics based on demographic considerations, things like the age composition of the workforce, etc.
Right. So the fact that maybe we have an aging population is going to lead to more retirees. That's going to affect the labor force participation rate.
But as you can see here, the drop is nearly 3 percentage points, way more than anything predicted by the other two projections.
And historically, this is a measure that's moved relatively little, right?
Exactly.
Or slowly tied to these long-term demographic changes.
We haven't seen, I mean, historically, at least since the World War II, you haven't seen much of a change in the labor force participation rate in a business cycle. And in fact, this has surprised economists because for the first time, really, that's why the unemployment rate is not telling the true picture. So traditionally, economists would look to the unemployment rate. To see what's happening in the labor market, when you've had a crisis and a recession. This is the first time really that they're having to look at deeper measures like the labor force participation rate.
And here we have another way that economists sometimes like to get at this same issue of how many people are working and how many people aren't trying to work.
Exactly. This is the civilian employment to population ratio. So in other words, it's the proportion of the adult population, that is everybody 16 and older, right? What proportion of that population is actually employed? As you can see here, there's been a huge decline here as well of nearly 5 percentage points since the onset of the recession.
And no recovery.
Exactly, no recovery. It just stayed flat all the way through. And really what this means is that you have a lot of missing workers. In other words, workers who are not being picked up by the official unemployment rate, but who, if they were still looking for work, would be part of the unemployed. So there are estimates, for example, that the number of missing workers is as high as close to 6 million workers, which would, if they were included in the official unemployment rate, it would push the unemployment rate up to close to 9.8% even today. That gives you a picture of how much of workers who ought to be looking for work, but who've just dropped out of the labor force, it's a huge number.
Oh, and there are a number of explanations that can and could be offered to try to explain this. But one of the issues that arises, because I think one of the things some people often point to is that, well, maybe the United States is becoming a lot more like Europe, where you have lower labor force participation rates than we have. I mean, just more people are simply not working.
Right. Well, yes, but you can see from the previous projections that that's not really true. There should be, even though there should be a slight decline from the onset of the recession in the labor force participation rate, it shouldn't be 3 percentage points.
And furthermore, there's no reason to expect that we would, if we are trending to look more like Europe, it shouldn't happen so dramatically.
Exactly.
Like almost overnight.
Exactly. It should be a slow process.
It should be a slower process.
Much slower process. You're right.
And so there certainly seems to be something really odd here for this sharp decline and then no recovery.
Absolutely. And in many ways, especially almost 5 years since we've officially, exited the recession. So this is a very, very weak recovery in terms of employment, and that's very worrying.
Now, one of the things that economists have started to think about, or that some economists have taken a look at, is some notion of regime uncertainty or policy uncertainty, that might be behind such a dramatic shift in what we've seen in the labor market, and then also the absence of recovery. What's meant by policy uncertainty, and how did that term come about?
Well, regime uncertainty is a term first used by an economic historian, Robert Higgs, who wrote a lot about the Great Depression. And in many ways, the Great Depression, that is the aftermath of the Great Depression, which is the 1930s, looks a lot like the last 5 years. You had sustained high unemployment rates of in double digits, sometimes over 15%. You had very low investment from private businesses to expand business, etc. And what Higgs said, really, the way he wanted to explain it, he said, well, there was a lot of uncertainty regarding the underlying security of private property rights. So investors in many ways were kind of scared to make investments, to expand businesses, to hire more workers, and therefore kind of bring the economy back after the Great Depression, largely because they were afraid of the underlying, would their private property rights be secure or not?
And so Higgs was talking about the time when
this is just to show that the recovery in this case has been much slower than previous recessions.
But Higgs was talking about the era of the New Deal, and so
exactly right. It's really, he was talking about the 1930s. To some extent, of course, Hoover between 29 and 33, although there's a common impression that Hoover was very laissez-faire and he just let the economy, left the economy alone. That's not true, and it's being revised in recent years. He did, for example, during those years, wages were propped up, not allowed to fall. There was also expansion in the budget, etc. But really, what Higgs is talking about is everything to do with FDR. Once FDR came to power in 1933. A huge, as you can see here, an amazing onslaught of regulation and legislation coming from Congress, all of which in some way or the other is undermining the property rights of investors. So that generates a huge amount of uncertainty. In many respects, it can be monetary in nature. So for example, you see here, there was America went off the gold standard in 1933. There's all kinds of regulations on agricultural. There was a huge restrictions on agricultural production, agricultural acreage, a lot of destruction of crops in order to prop up agricultural prices as part of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Then you had the National Industrial Recovery Act, which is, of course, quite infamous, where you had a lot of cartelization of industry, imposition of all kinds of codes which industrialists had to follow with respect to labor unions, minimum wages, etc. But it just overall, it's the atmosphere, so to speak, which investors are operating in.
And so just to elaborate on this a little bit, Higgs wasn't looking at the period of time during the crash of 1920 to 29 to 33. So the crash had occurred.
Right, the crash had occurred. We'd had 4 years already of unprecedented high rates of unemployment, which again, at that time was unprecedented in American history. Most crashes were followed by very quick recoveries. So for example, the recession of 1920-21, which nobody remembers for good reason, that's because the economy picked up within a year. Already it had been unprecedented, but of course the whole decade of the 1930s was essentially a lost decade.
Because I think as economists have, I think now fairly widely accept that the New Deal didn't actually end the Great Depression.
No, it did not. There was a slight recovery in the mid-30s, but then again, there was towards the end of the 30s, there was a kind of mini recession within a bigger recession, so to speak. In fact, if you look at the measures for investment, private investment, the 1930s is the only decade in American economic history where you actually had consumption of the capital stock. In other words, investors weren't investing enough to just replace, and maintain the capital goods which already existed. Forget adding to it. And that's never happened before or since in American economic history.
And one of the things about having so many actions going on at the same time, it does create, not in anyone in isolation, but in combination, this era of uncertainty.
Right, and this is a quote from Lamont DuPont, a huge industrialist in those days. As you can see here, he says, uncertainty rules the tax situation, the labor situation, the monetary situation, and practically every legal condition under which industry must operate. Are taxes to go higher, lower, or stay where they are? We don't know. Is labor to be union or non-union? Are we to have inflation or deflation? More government spending or less? So it's just a whole plethora of regulations coming from all sides, and the uncertainty that causes as to what will be the future trend, over the next foreseeable future for the investors.
So I think one of the important things that economists get from Higgs's idea about regime uncertainty is that as far as the New Deal went, it could have possibly gone farther. And at the time, it wasn't clear it wasn't going to go a lot farther.
Nobody knew at that time, what to expect. Looking back, we can say, oh, the New Deal didn't really go that far. It's not like it imposed outright socialism or something. But as far as investors were concerned, in the 1930s, it was unprecedented in American history, such an onslaught of legislation. So they didn't know, has there been a huge change in the attitudes of those in power? They didn't know, and so they would hold back on investment. And that, of course, greatly harmed any potential recovery.
And Higgs points particularly to what's known as the Second New Deal that started in 1935. And this was a point in time where the rhetoric
also shifted.
Really changed.
Yes.
And here we have an example.
Right, and there's an example of FDR from a 1936 campaign speech. He's basically fulminating at organized money, business in general, etc. And in fact, throughout the 1930s, as Higgs points out, there was a kind of a warlike mentality. That there is this kind of recession had to be fought exactly like you fight a war. The whole nation had to be mobilized in order to fight this thing. And it's sort of an attitude shift, in a sense, amongst Americans of all class and every kind. And this is, then of course it went on to become even more anti-business, the rhetoric. But it was just, in some sense, people thought a new era.
Right. And just because we know, the New Deal didn't lead to socialism in America doesn't mean that at the time that wasn't a reasonable belief.
And it's not necessarily that it had to lead to outright socialism. It's just what's happening or what's going to happen in the near future. I mean, if we make an investment today, is the government in the next 3 years going to say, well, that sector we're going to appropriate certain industries or certain enterprises, not allow you to function the way you thought you could function. So it's a lot of uncertainty.
Certainly there could have been nationalization of some industries, even if we didn't have nationalization of all
or
industries.
Price controls, even things like price controls, quality control, product controls, what you cannot produce. And that had been done in many instances in the 30s.
No, so some economists have picked up on this idea, and I think one of the things we can see here that some economists have created what's known as a measure of policy uncertainty.
Yes, this is a measure created by some economists at Stanford, I believe, and Chicago. Recently, they tried to get an index of economic policy uncertainty. So, if we had to measure, in some sense, how much uncertainty there is regarding the policies which governments are going to undertake in the near future. They've largely tried to gather it from news articles and various sources. And as you can see here, for example, you can see that their index is very robust. There was a huge spike at 9/11, for example. There was a huge spike in wartime. There's spikes at election time. Normal times when you'd expect uncertainty to spike. But of course, you can see there's a huge shift in the extent of uncertainty in the aftermath of the recession. I mean, there's a huge upward shift in the extent of uncertainty. And to some extent, it's caused by, again, lots of different things, the bailouts, which changed, in some sense, the rules of the economic game. The whole debate about stimulus, the whole everything to do with the tax and spending situation, the Fed and its many interventions, lots of different reasons. And
I think one of the interesting things to note here is that, yes, I mean, surely we would have expected in 2008 maybe unprecedented uncertainty, and we had that, but you can certainly see in 2009, 2010, 2011,
it's not gone down.
It's not gone down.
It's only increased.
Certainly not to anything like the level that it was before.
Absolutely, and it's only increased, if anything.
And that's had an effect seemingly on investment as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, things even like the Affordable Care Act, the DoddFrank bill, these huge, giant omnibus regulations, essentially, where investors and everybody doesn't even know the exact nature of all the laws. As you can see here, that all of these factors have played a huge role in a huge decline in private investment. Private investment in 2012 is 41% below where it was in 2007.
So these numbers, just for our viewers, they're normalized so that the level of investment that we had in 2007 is set at 100.
Exactly. So they're indexed and it's set at 100. So it makes it easy to see. Firstly, you can see there was a huge decline between 2007 and 2009. In fact, this is net investment, implying that new investment on new capital goods, fresh capital goods, actually it went negative, implying that in 2009, again, there was capital consumption. So capital goods produced earlier were not even replaced.
So what we saw during the Great Depression for an entire decade.
For an entire decade, but it's happened only for a year. So again, this is nothing like the extent of what happened in the Great Depression, but it has very similar features. The scale is lower, but it's, again, since the Great Depression, this is the first time that it's been so bad 5 years into any kind of recovery, post-recession.
And in particular, certain types of investments should be if it is, like, say, policy or regime uncertainty that's driving dragging down the economy.
Yes.
There are certain types of investments where this should particularly show up.
Absolutely. It should show up more in long-term as compared to short-term investment, simply because you'd expect investors to face businessmen to have more uncertainty regarding longer-term, the longer-term future. And you can see here evidence for that. So these two graphs essentially track, these two lines essentially track, firstly, the proportion of investment in longer-term investment, which is the top line, the light blue line. You can see that plunged after the recession. And the second one is talking about the average durability of private domestic GDP. In other words, what is the lifespan of the goods created that's composed or GDP is composed of. And you can see there too, there's been quite a sharp decline.
And longer term investments are more subject to uncertainty. How so?
Well, simply because it's more years. Firstly, there's uncertainty just from a non-regulatory standpoint. What will prices be in the long-term future, et cetera. But this is not about that. This is about what could happen over the next 5 years to property rights, in my sector. Will there be new regulations? And so while it might be possible, for example, to say, over the next 1 year, I don't really foresee much regulation coming from Congress or legislation coming from Congress, I can't say the same thing about 5 years. Right. Will this trend intensify? Will it die out? What will be the nature of the next government in power? Things of that nature.
Now, we touched on a couple of the acts that some economists have pointed to that might be responsible for some of this uncertainty. Yes. The Affordable Care Act, and then also the DoddFrank regulation, the DoddFrank financial reform law. And those were passed in 2010. So somebody might say, like, well, okay, those were passed. We had those debates.
Yes.
Whatever effect they might have had on business attitudes or whatever, they should have had their effect on 2010. Why are we still having uncertainty maybe from these acts in 2011, 2012? Well,
largely because they're acts which don't really specify exactly what the regulations are going to be. In the case of the DoddFrank Act, for example, there are lots of entities which have been created, government entities, as a result of the act, who will then begin to regulate the financial sector. As we've seen with the Affordable Care Act, you've had so many, as the act has been implemented, newer and newer information comes through, which affects different parties differently. The Affordable Care Act has implications for taxes. It has implications for the costs of businesses, and that's unfolding as the legislation is being gradually enforced. I think Nancy Pelosi had that quote where she said, well, to find out what's in the bill, pass it and then implement it, or something to that effect, back in the day.
And so that's what's really, I think, in many ways behind the statements of people say, oh, businesses just don't know how, like, say, the Affordable Care Act, or especially in 2011, 2012, businesses were saying, we just don't know how this act's going to affect us yet.
Right, and it's not just the Affordable Care Act. It's also things like the whole spending situation, right? The government spending, government debt's been increasing at a never-seen rate. In American economic history. Everybody knows there's an entitlement spending problem. Right. What's going to happen to taxes? How the tax rate's going to rise? There's been every year there's logjam in the Congress, fighting. Nobody knows what's going to happen. Are taxes going to be raised in the near future? Because it looks like something has to be done to meet this, payments problem, basically, as far as the government is concerned. On the other hand, could there be drastic cuts in certain parts of government spending? Right. Which, while it would be more desirable than tax hikes, it could affect certain businesses who are dependent on revenues coming from, certain government programs, things of that nature. So there are
sometimes, when government cuts programs, they end up cutting the programs that actually do the most good for the economy, not necessarily the ones that do the least good.
Exactly. So there are lots of questions, balls in the air. There's also the whole the situation with the Fed. The Fed has pumped so much money into the banking system. How are they going to? Now they're beginning to taper, their purchases of bonds of housing and government debt from banks, but. What's happening to, what if that money starts leaking out? Right now the banks are holding most of that money. What if it starts leaking out? What is the Fed going to do to exit, so to speak? So all of these things are causing a lot of uncertainty.
And I suppose also for some time after 2007 and 2008, there was also uncertainty tied to housing markets and exactly to what extent foreclosures were going to occur, were they going to be blocked,
right.
Were prices ever going to allow to actually adjust all the way to where they would need to, or were we going to try to continue to prop them up?
Right, and also lots of investors, businesses, I'm sure they know that what the Fed's been doing is unsustainable. At some point, they're going to stop propping up the housing market. They're going to stop, buying all of this debt, which is keeping interest rates low. What will happen to government debt? The government debt payments when interest rates start rising.
Right.
What's going to happen to housing prices or asset prices when interest rates eventually start rising? So it's a wait and watch mode. And of course, like Higgs also mentioned, even today, businessmen also don't know what's the attitude of those in power with respect to the actual private property, their attitude on private business and private property rights. The solution to everything seems to be to set up a new bureau, to regulate further, to watch further what private businesses are doing. So investors are obviously concerned.
And just again, to emphasize here, when we talk about taxes going up, I mean, if you're a business person running a business in oil and natural gas or whatever, the overall level of taxes isn't necessarily what you're talking about. It's what taxes?
It's the marginal taxes, basically. How much of an
and the taxes that fall on your business.
Exactly,
so,
of course, yes. So there's
a lot of uncertainty about, even if we can make we might be able to make a guess that taxes are going to go up. That doesn't tell us what taxes are going to go up. And that's really what matters a lot of times for the
I mean, there are hundreds of different taxes imposed on so many different commodities and different sources of income, which is going to rise, which is not going to rise. Like you're right. So industries don't know. If you know that there's a huge spending issue, there's basically a deficit issue, debt issue, is my industry going to be affected more than others? Is it going to be affected at all?
And we see some evidence of this policy uncertainty even when we look at polls conducted of business, right?
Exactly. So you can see here that this was a survey conducted of investors by Citibank in July 2011. Of course, all such surveys are not necessarily precise in a quantitative sense, but they give a good indication. As you can see here, amongst all the different concerns which they listed to the investors, the ones which, the maximum percentage of respondents picked government policy missteps as their biggest risks to the economy over the next 12 months.
By far.
By far, a huge margin. So you can, everything, and since government policy necessarily affects the property rights of investors, there's a case for the whole, notion of regime uncertainty.
Well, thank you very much. I think this idea of regime uncertainty has been a very transformative one in economists and among economists. Certainly has certainly affected how I think about the economy, and it seems to have some relevance for where we've been at here in the U.S. economy recently. So thanks for coming on and telling us a little bit about this.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me.
And thanks. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.